The surrender of Japan on September 2, 1945, marked the end of the Pacific War, but it also initiated a profound transformation within the country, one that would stretch far beyond the cessation of hostilities. In the aftermath of Japan's capitulation, a shadow of uncertainty loomed over its wartime industries. The aircraft factories, once the heart of Japan's military might, now found themselves grappling with a new reality. What was to become of their vast, specialized infrastructure in a time of peace? The scale of Japan's wartime production had been immense, with over 27,000 aircraft built for the Imperial Army and Navy between 1937 and 1945, yet by the time the war ended, this manufacturing network would be disassembled, abandoned, or repurposed in ways that would alter its legacy forever. Initially, Japan's industrial capacity was in ruins. The Allied strategic bombing campaign had left cities and factories in a state of devastation. In total, roughly 60% of Japan's industrial infrastructure was destroyed or severely damaged by the war. Aerial raids, many of which targeted industrial sites, had struck at the heart of Japan's aircraft manufacturing. The famous Mitsubishi factories in Nagoya, for example, had been reduced to rubble. But even as Japan faced immediate economic dislocation, its aircraft factories represented not just military production, but a national effort that had been built on years of development, skilled labor, and specialized materials. In the immediate aftermath of the war, the focus was on reconstruction, yet this was complicated by the realization that much of Japan's industrial infrastructure, including its aircraft factories, was now surplus to the nation's needs. The terms of the Allied occupation, led by the United States, demanded that Japan demilitarize, which included dismantling or repurposing its war industries. The Japanese government was ordered to eliminate its capacity to build military aircraft, and Allied forces supervised the disbanding of the country's military-industrial complex. The first steps in this process came swiftly. Within weeks of Japan's surrender, the American authorities began surveying the nation's industrial landscape. The United States, under the guidance of the Allied occupation, specifically General Douglas MacArthur, sought to prevent any resurgence of Japanese military power. Aircraft factories, along with other war-related industries, were to be either dismantled or repurposed. The immediate directive was clear: stop all production of military materials. At the time of Japan's surrender, many of the major aircraft manufacturers were still technically operational, albeit on a reduced scale. Companies like Mitsubishi, Nijima, and Kawasaki had been at the forefront of producing some of Japan's most notable wartime aircraft, including the A6M0, the Ki-84He-8, and the Ki-61Hien. These companies were structured with vast, complex plants spread across the country. However, in a matter of months, the Japanese government, under pressure from the occupation forces, began the painful task of either halting or repurposing these facilities. The dismantling of Japan's aircraft factories involved both physical destruction and a gradual process of deindustrialization. Many of the factories were located in areas that had been heavily bombed during the war, rendering them difficult, if not impossible, to repair. In cities like Nagoya, where Mitsubishi's main aircraft production plant had once flourished, remnants of bombed-out factory complexes were abandoned, left to rot in the wake of the war. Other factories in rural regions, untouched by bombs but burdened by the absence of demand for military aircraft, faced an uncertain future. The Japanese government, struggling under the weight of an occupied nation, lacked the resources to maintain such a large, specialized industry. In 1947, under the direction of the occupying forces, the Japanese aircraft industry was officially dismantled. This did not mean the end of Japan's industrial potential, but it did represent the end of its capacity for large-scale military aircraft production. By the end of 1947, nearly all of Japan's major aircraft manufacturers had either been closed, repurposed, or stripped of their wartime production capabilities. At the same time, the Japanese economy was under immense pressure. Wartime destruction, the collapse of trade routes, and the need for massive reconstruction left Japan's economy in a fragile state. The Allied forces imposed harsh limitations on Japanese industrial output. Imports of materials and resources were limited, making the prospect of rebuilding the aircraft factories into civilian production hubs exceedingly difficult. Many of these factories were ill-suited for peacetime work, particularly in the absence of the raw materials that had fueled wartime production. As the industry's war-related output collapsed, the repurposing of Japan's aircraft factories began. Some facilities were adapted for civilian use, primarily for the production of basic industrial goods. In places like the former Nakajima factories, which had once produced the famous Ki-43 Oscar and Ki-84 Hay-8 fighters, the focus shifted to the manufacture of civilian products, including motorcycles and small machines. However, the scale of adaptation was often limited, as Japan lacked both the technological infrastructure and the capital to fully transition from wartime to peacetime production. The aircraft factories that had once employed thousands of workers began to lose their relevance in a post-war world. In some cases, factories were sold off to private industry. The economic pressure to recover from the war forced many of Japan's largest manufacturers to diversify their portfolios. Kawasaki, which had produced aircraft such as the Ki-61 Hien, found itself refocused on the production of automobiles and heavy machinery. Mitsubishi, too, restructured, shifting some of its plants toward civilian manufacturing. However, these transitions were not smooth. The loss of the aircraft manufacturing industry was a blow to the nation's pride and economy. By the early 1950s, Japan's role as a producer of military aircraft had been entirely erased from the industrial landscape. The materials that had once been used to build Japan's fighter planes, bombers, and transports, lightweight alloys, high-quality steel, and specialized components, were either scrapped or redirected toward other uses. The massive factory complexes that had supported the war effort sat empty or were repurposed for more mundane tasks. This shift in focus was not without cost. The immense infrastructure and resources that had gone into the production of military aircraft during the war represented a colossal financial investment, much of which was now written off as a historical loss. As the early years of the occupation passed, the Japanese government and its people began to realize that the war's industrial legacy, particularly in terms of the aircraft factories, would never be fully recaptured. These factories were not merely places of work, they had become symbols of a bygone era. The men and women who had labored within these walls, building machines of war for an empire in decline, now found their livelihoods tied to industries that had little to do with the glory of the past. The large-scale aircraft factories that had once been hubs of innovation and national pride had become obsolete relics, their destinies sealed by the end of the war. In the years following the dismantling of Japan's aircraft factories, the question of what had truly been lost remained. The resources that had gone into these facilities, both human and material, had been redirected into rebuilding a shattered nation. The factories themselves were often sold, abandoned, or left to decay in silence. Even in the 1950s, as Japan began to rebuild and shift toward an economic miracle, the scars of wartime production were still evident, though largely invisible to the outside world. Thus, the fate of Japan's aircraft factories after the war was not a story of heroism or recovery but one of stark, material loss. The question of what truly happened to these industrial giants, their workers, their legacy, and their immense output, remains a complex and often overlooked aspect of post-war history. The aircraft factories were never resurrected, never repurposed to their full potential. Instead, they faded into the background of a nation's recovery, remembered only in fragments and forgotten parts. The full scale of what was lost in this process, however, can never be understated. The dismantling of Japan's aircraft factories in the immediate aftermath of World War II was not a single, unified process but rather a fragmented and complex series of events. The factories that had once been the backbone of Japan's military aviation program became a symbol of the challenges the country faced in transitioning from a wartime economy to one focused on peacetime reconstruction. While the official cessation of aircraft production came quickly, the legacy of Japan's aircraft factories continued to shape the nation's industrial landscape for years. The abandonment, repurposing, and slow decay of these facilities were merely the start of a longer story of economic pressure, industrial reorganization, and national identity. As Japan moved into the 1950s, the country began its recovery, but the scars of its wartime industry were far from healed. The most significant challenge for Japan, both economically and politically, was the question of how to rebuild without the benefit of the military-industrial complex that had once fueled its aggressive expansion. The destruction of aircraft factories, along with the broader collapse of Japan's war-related industries, left the nation with a void in terms of both skilled labor and the specialized infrastructure that had supported its military efforts. In its place, Japan was forced to turn to new sectors to drive its post-war economy. However, the wartime industrial base that had been so deeply embedded in the country's structure could not easily be repurposed or erased. The first wave of industrial repurposing in Japan involved turning former aircraft factories into civilian manufacturing facilities. While the scale of these adaptations was often limited, some success was achieved. Mitsubishi, for example, began to transition its factories into civilian production. After the dismantling of its military aircraft division, the company refocused its efforts on manufacturing automobiles, heavy machinery, and eventually aircraft parts for civilian use. It was a significant shift for the company, one that required adapting its production processes and retooling its factories for entirely different kinds of output. Yet even Mitsubishi, with its vast experience in military aircraft production, could not fully escape the legacy of its wartime past. In Nagoya, where Mitsubishi's largest aircraft factory had once produced the iconic A6M0, the transition to civilian production was not without difficulty. The site was severely damaged during the war, and although reconstruction was possible, it never returned to its full wartime capacity. Mitsubishi, however, was able to produce small civilian aircraft and, later, components for other types of transportation, but it took years to recover from the devastation. The size of the factory, which had once been able to turn out hundreds of aircraft annually, was now ill-suited to the smaller-scale civilian needs of the post-war era. Despite these efforts, most aircraft factories, particularly those in the more heavily bombed areas, were left to deteriorate. The sheer scale of the damage inflicted on these factories during the war made full restoration unfeasible, especially given the lack of resources available for rebuilding. The raw materials necessary to construct the sophisticated machines of war were scarce, and the economic policies imposed by the Allies limited Japan's ability to import the materials needed for industrial production. For many of Japan's smaller, regional aircraft manufacturers, such as Najima, which had been responsible for producing aircraft like the Ki-43 Oscar, the transition to civilian production was less successful. The Nakajima factories, located primarily in the Tochigi and Saitama prefectures, were initially adapted to produce agricultural machinery, motorcycles, and small engines, but the shift was neither seamless nor sustainable. Nakajima had been a major force in Japan's aviation industry, producing not only fighters but also important transport aircraft like the Ki-49 Helen. The retooling of its factories, once hubs of high-precision manufacturing, required an entirely different skill set. The focus on civilian goods did little to tap into the immense human resources and technical expertise developed during the war years. The shift from cutting-edge military production to mundane civilian products resulted in a mismatch between the workforce's skills and the demands of post-war Japan's new industrial needs. Moreover, the dismantling and repurposing process was fraught with political challenges. As part of the Allied occupation's broader agenda, Japan's military-industrial complex was not just dismantled physically, but also politically. The United States, as the occupying force, sought to prevent the re-emergence of Japanese militarism, and the destruction of the country's ability to produce military aircraft was a key component of this strategy. The dismantling of the aircraft factories was thus intertwined with the broader process of demilitarization, which was deeply entrenched in the American occupation policies. In line with this policy, Allied forces sought to impose restrictions on the development of Japan's military-industrial base, with some factories being completely repurposed for civilian production while others were scrapped altogether. In some cases, entire factories were disbanded, and their equipment was either destroyed or shipped overseas. This was particularly true in regions like Kyushu, where the Mitsubishi factories had produced several models of bombers and fighters. The economic pressure, exacerbated by the loss of markets and materials, made it impossible for these facilities to transition into sustainable, peacetime industries. Despite the seemingly irreversible nature of this transformation, certain elements of Japan's aircraft manufacturing legacy did manage to survive. Some former workers who had been part of the once thriving aircraft industry found their way into the burgeoning automotive sector. The technical knowledge and craftsmanship that had been honed during the war years would play a role in shaping Japan's economic future. As the 1950s progressed, Japan's industrial landscape shifted dramatically, with the nation emerging as a global powerhouse in fields like automotive manufacturing, consumer electronics, and industrial machinery. However, the connection to the wartime aircraft factories was tenuous at best. The country had moved on from its military roots, but the scars of its industrial past were never entirely erased. In some cases, the repurposed factories did give rise to new industries. Kawasaki, once a major producer of military aircraft, found success in the post-war period through the production of heavy machinery and motorcycles. The company's transition from military to civilian manufacturing was facilitated by its existing infrastructure and expertise in precision engineering, but the shift was not without its difficulties. Like Mitsubishi, Kawasaki had to adapt its production lines and workforce to meet the demands of the civilian market. The company eventually became a leader in the motorcycle industry, but this success came after years of struggle and a significant shift in both corporate strategy and national priorities. While some factories were repurposed or survived through transition, the broader fate of Japan's aircraft manufacturing legacy was a story of economic loss and national transformation. The factories that had once been emblematic of Japan's military might became symbolic of the country's shift away from aggression and war. Their physical decline mirrored the broader collapse of the military-industrial complex that had sustained the Empire of Japan. The story of Japan's aircraft factories in the post-war years is also one of historical loss. While some remnants of the aircraft industry found new life in the civilian sector, many more were lost to the passage of time. The grand facilities that had churned out thousands of aircraft for a military machine now stood abandoned or repurposed for completely different uses. The historical significance of these factories, their role in Japan's wartime economy, their contribution to the air war in the Pacific, was slowly forgotten as the nation sought to rebuild itself on new foundations.